Okay, here we go for the million and one first time. Um, yeah, so this is lecture 1 for Traditional Chinese Medicine Summer 2012. I encourage you, while you're listening to the recordings, to get out a piece of note paper, take some notes, be active, be an active listener, not just a passive listener. Additionally, it might help you to get out your photocopies of your readings and highlight things that I talk about. Any way that you can get yourself actively involved instead of just passively listening is going to help you to learn this stuff better and more easily. It creates a bigger memory network and you're better able to recall it the more memory network you have. So be an active listener. What else? I tend to be fairly conversational when I am lecturing, and it's really going to be no different with a recorded so-called lecture. I'm doing this off the top of my head, no notes. I think I know the material well enough that I can do that, aside from the fact that it feels awkward and a little stilted to be talking into a microphone and not talking to a live bunch of people. So, without further ado, here we go. All right, so I don't have a lot to say about the foreword. Um, it's really just a sort of a personal memoir, but pay attention to the very first paragraph about James Reston. He was kind of instrumental in sort of busting open the transition of acceptance of Chinese medicine in the West. Something that comes up a lot in talking about traditional Chinese medicine is this idea of Taoism, or the Tao, which has a couple of different meanings. Sometimes it's thought of as an unbroken wholeness or a relational continuum. So think about that. What does a relational continuum mean? So a continuum is just a series, I guess you could say, of changes or states of being that are all related to each other, and they don't exist without connection to another part of the continuum. So each section of the continuum is related, a relational continuum. That sort of thinking really underpins the idea of traditional Chinese medicine, and it predates the way we think in the West in a way that really developed in the 17th century. It's really been around for only about 400 years. The idea that man and nature are separate, that we're not part of the natural world around us, which is another way of saying that we're not part of the Tao. And that idea of Tao, as I said, is absolutely central to the thinking of traditional Chinese medicine. So for some people, Taoism is a religion. For other people, it's a philosophy, or maybe a sort of a worldview, or Weltanschauung is a fancy German word for worldview. It predated any sort of technology. There were certainly nothing like internet access, electronic stuff. There was certainly nothing like a steam-powered engine or a gas-powered engine. It was an absolutely non-technological society. So people had no other real choice except to sort of think of themselves as part of the universe, part of nature, and as such, they never considered themselves separately. No one thing could be considered separately without being considered in the context of its surroundings. Another aspect of Taoism is that ancestors are absolutely revered, literally as godlike figures, deities. And in an effort to show respect to the gods, they often had shrines, still have shrines and altars. But more importantly than that, they simply did not ever dissect them. It would have been the ultimate insult or ultimate disrespect to disrupt the integrity of the body, the whole of the body. So in traditional Chinese medicine, they don't have the same sort of understanding that we have of an anatomy of location, or sort of a map of the body. They just don't think about it that way. They think about it in terms of related function. So Taoism like many things in Chinese medicine, or many things that underpin Chinese medicine, Taoism is thought of in a couple of different ways. It can be that unbroken wholeness that I mentioned. It also could be the word Tao can simply be translated as the way, meaning the way to live your life, how to best live your life. Both of those interpretations are correct. There's no right or wrong there. And that's pretty typical of a lot of concepts in Chinese medicine. There are no straight answers. So just a little bit of an aside, just to give you a little comparison and contrast. Taoism, as I said, emphasizes making the right choices in how to live your personal life, how to eat the right food, how to exercise, how to take herbs, how to get acupuncture, whatever is going to best support your personal life. Confucianism, another really, really well-known philosophy in China, and you've probably heard of it, Confucius, another Chinese philosopher. His approach was to teach people how they should conduct their civic affairs, how society should best conduct its civic affairs. And orderly conduct is absolutely, absolutely to be prized and highly valued. Harmony above all else. Keeping in mind the idea of Taoism, going back to the idea of Taoism, the true physician teaches the Tao, and that can be thought of as how to live. And that's from Beinfield and Korngold. So changing gears a little bit, I've talked a little bit now about the history of Taoism and its underpinnings of Chinese medicine as a philosophical underpinning. There's a philosophical underpinning to Western biomedicine as well, and that really goes back almost exclusively to René Descartes, who was a really important figure during the 17th century, philosopher, mathematician, scientist. You've probably heard the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." That was Descartes. He promoted a couple of ways of thinking that have really just completely shaped for 400 years what Western biomedicine has become. First of all, he said that the mind and body were absolutely two separate things. It's a concept called dualism, and it's, as I said, prevailed for about 400 years, and it's really only been in the last 5 to 10 years that Western biomedicine has started to evolve back to the idea that the mind and body cannot be separated and have to be considered together. Descartes was also famous for his dissection and mapping of the body. He's the first person that really created the idea of anatomy the way we know it. Another thing that he influenced is the idea of Cartesian coordinates. I'm sure you took junior high algebra or geometry or something like that. The idea of Cartesian coordinates in mapping and in math have everything to do with Descartes as well. So prior to the Renaissance and Descartes' influence on Western thinking, Western philosophy was a lot more akin to Eastern philosophy. Again, a pre-technological society, really well up into the, what we would consider relatively contemporary history, 300-400 years ago, 400-500 years ago maybe. And it was really in the 1600s that scientific philosophy, as influenced by Descartes, started to take a hold, and people saw themselves as separate from living systems and nature surrounding them. Reductionist thinking is another important concept to come out of Descartes' work. So the idea is that if you can study a problem in greater and greater and greater detail with a finer and finer and finer figurative and literal microscope, you can find one cause or one event that creates any given situation. There's a very, very much of a cause and effect type of thinking. So diagnosing a disease is a perfect example of reductionist thinking. If you can find the one single cause, you can fix it. Just another one of these little asides that I like to throw in. Antonin van Leeuwenhoek, that's how you pronounce that crazy long last name, Leeuwenhoek, was the first person to create a microscope, again in the 17th century. He was a working contemporary of Descartes, and looking through a microscope, he was able to see bacteria, he was able to see fungi, he was able to see protozoa, he was able to see spermatozoa, and he collectively referred to those as animalcules or bacteria. And his creation of the microscope was sort of the underpinning or technological advancement that made it possible in the 18th and 19th century to prove the germ theory of disease, which is another version of reductionist thinking. So if Western biomedicine has been around for, say 400 years or so, traditional Chinese medicine is tremendously ancient. It's maybe as much as 5,000 years old. It's undergone many, many changes and advancements, as any set of scientific principles does. Although it's about 5,000 years, 4 to 5,000 years old, the earliest known written textbook, the Inner Classic of the Yellow Emperor, is maybe about 1,500 years old and has been given many, many translations. The original work is probably lost to time. The original meaning of the work is lost to time. But as you can see, I pulled a picture of it off of, I don't know, Amazon or Barnes & Noble or something. It's still an actively published textbook. So traditional Chinese medicine made it into Europe by the early 16th or 17th century, at the same time that Descartes' reductionist view of the world was starting to gain a foothold. It also was in the United States during the 18th and 19th century, particularly the 19th century, brought by Chinese immigrants who arrived to work on railroads. So it was definitely here. It was definitely being used. There's plenty of stories about it. Nevertheless, Western biomedicine technologies really remained the dominant paradigm until well into the 20th century. Another contrast to bring up and point out to you is that medical ideas, medical technologies, medical philosophies traveled in both directions. It wasn't just Chinese medicine showing up on the Pacific coast of the United States. Missionaries brought Western ideas and technologies to the East. And by the mid-20th century, this is kind of interesting, Western medicine actually sort of started to take a prominent position in Chinese medical schools and Chinese medical thinking. Sort of culturally and politically at that time, China was the Chinese government was trying to shape a modern contemporary society. So they really promoted the idea of using Western technologies. And actually, TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, started to fall from favor. But again, more political and social changes. By the mid to late 20th century, the government was re-promoting the use of traditional Chinese medicine. And that's about the time of the rise of communism, the closing of the so-called bamboo curtain. If there was an iron curtain between Eastern Europe, Russia, East Germany, and the West, it was called the bamboo curtain in communist China. So up until the mid-20th century, East was East, West was West. There wasn't a whole lot of cross-pollination, some, but not a ton. Then in 1970, 71, something like that, I don't remember precisely the year, New York Times reporter James Reston was in China with President Nixon, who was on the first diplomatic trip to China in recent history. There had been a great political and social rift between China and the West. So President Nixon was in China. New York Times reporter James Reston was there and had an emergency appendectomy. And his post-operative pain control was conducted with acupuncture. So he wrote a story about his personal experiences that got published in the New York Times, of course a huge and influential newspaper, and the door got blown wide open. So even 40 or so years later, there's a lot of confusion about Chinese medicine. Some people kind of write it off as being folk medicine, as being random. How could it possibly work that some crazy herbs and some little pins stuck in the body could be beneficial? On the other end of the spectrum, and I would bet that some of you are in this group, on the other end of the spectrum, there are a lot of people who sort of revere Chinese medicine because it's old, it must be more true, more holistic, it considers the whole body, it promotes natural healing, and so they sort of set the idea of Chinese medicine up on a pedestal, as if it's going to cure all the ills of mankind in a way that Western medicine can't. Both of those approaches really devalue what Chinese medicine is. It's not quackery, and it's not a cure-all, a panacea. It's a system unto itself. And it produces tangible results. There's no question about that. It definitely works for a lot of different things. It works well for some things that Western medicine doesn't work well for. But it also is a pretty coherent and systematic philosophy. It works because it's a system unto itself. I think that's a really good way of describing it. So that's what this course is about, is scratching at the very surface of what some of those systemic thoughts are.